A stranger in an antique gown leaned over her desk and told her she had minutes left to live. The girl who had spent the whole year tormenting her would be the one to do it. The fist came before anyone in that classroom thought to step between them, and nobody moved afterwards either. She went over the desks, cracked her skull on the tile, and the blood spread faster than the screaming. But the clock had not started yet. Wind it back, and the morning was still ordinary. Nahuiju sat alone in an emptying classroom and wished the world would end before tomorrow arrived. A meteor, an earthquake, anything large enough to take everyone with her at once. Then her name was shouted across the room, and the wish went back in its box. Alexa wanted the homework. Huiju had fallen asleep before finishing it, and said so as quietly as she could. The answer to that was a shove that put her on the floor in front of everyone. Alexa asked how a person could be so irresponsible as to sleep instead of doing someone else's work. She said it slowly, so the whole room could hear which one of them was supposed to be ashamed. Huiju thought the irresponsible one was whoever handed her homework off. She kept the thought behind her teeth. Yesterday, looking away was ignoring her. Today, looking up was glaring. There was no correct face to wear. A hand slipped, apparently, and something sharp caught her across the throat. Alexa apologized while laughing. Pencil cases and erasers came across the room next, and the whole class laughed along with it on cue. The boys near the window watched with the flat, patient faces of people waiting for it to finish. Someone said she was bragging about being weak, and that if she could not protect herself, she should die. Huiju froze in the middle of the noise because that voice had not come from anyone standing in the room. Heads turned towards the windows and back again. Nobody else in the class seemed to have heard it at all. Alexa's face twisted, already winding up to start again, and then every single thing in the room stopped mid-motion. The girl stood frozen with her mouth open, lightning crawling across the cracked walls behind her. Every student in the room was locked in place, caught between one breath and the next. Huiju turned her head to look at all of it, and hers was the only head in the building that turned. She asked out loud what was happening, and nobody in the frozen classroom answered, because nobody in it could. Then heels came walking across the frozen floor towards her, striking small sparks out of nothing at every step. A silver-haired woman in white walked in through a room with no open door, admiring the ring on her hand. Huiju stared up at a gown that belonged in a museum, not a high school. She managed a stammered "excuse me." The woman kept walking as though the interruption were charming. Then she smiled, hand at her chest, and light gathered around her like she had brought her own weather. She named herself Grain Deshea, and added that she had not expected to find a girl who let herself be beaten. She wondered aloud why anyone would be born into such a weak shell, and said she should have chosen better. Huiju shouted back, demanding to know if she was a reaper, a ghost, or an exhibitionist in costume. Grain covered her mouth with one ringed hand, genuinely startled that this girl did not recognize her at all. She asked whether Huiju truly did not know her. Huiju confirmed it with all the dignity she had left. That set her laughing until she had to hold her stomach, delighted to be called a reaper by a child. She supposed a girl carrying a dragon's memories would never have lived like this in the first place. Then she brightened, said it had been ages since she met her younger sibling's spirit, and offered a secret. Huiju asked what secret. She was still treating all of this as a joke. By the reckoning of this world, Grain said, counting it off on her fingers, roughly 5 more minutes. She looked down at the girl with the warmth of someone announcing a change in the weather. Huiju demanded to know what she was talking about, and got a smirk in return. If she wanted the thing put more precisely than that, Grain said, then she was perfectly happy to be precise. Behind her, Alexa's frozen face was still locked around a shout that had not finished leaving her mouth. It would be an accident, of course. One swing of that fist, nothing more. Grain said it gently, the way you tell a child that a story has an ending. She asked whether the girl who had taken all those beatings meant to accept a death like that as well. She called the whole thing lame, and flicked her fingers as though brushing dust off an expensive sleeve. Then she said, "Take care, kiddo," and the light around her began to thin. Huiju shouted for her to wait. The clock on the wall gave a single click and started ticking again. The room came back all at once, students stumbling, none of them aware they had ever stopped. Everyone in the room was moving again, laughing again, complaining again, which meant the 5 minutes had started counting. Alexa was already mid-complaint on the far side of the desks, furious about something new that had nothing to do with her. A pen she had bought days ago was on the floor, and that was somehow Huiju's fault. and it would not end. She screamed it into the girl's face, and the room made space for her. Huiju had heard idiot and trash so often that the words no longer landed anywhere. Her eyes went red and hot, and for once it was not fear doing it. Alexa demanded to know why she was looking away again and reached out to grab her. Then she stopped, because the girl she had been hitting all year had not flinched. Huiju's hands were shaking so badly she could see it. She admitted to herself privately that she was frightened. But she reached up anyway, out of the crouch she had spent a year living in, and her fingers closed on Alexa's wrist. She held on with everything she had, terrified the whole time, and simply refused to let that arm come down again. Alexa's head snapped back as her own hair was pulled, and she screamed at the shock of it. 4 students backed away with their mouths open. None of them had a script for this. Striking first, Huiju decided, was not the worst way to spend her last minutes. Alexa twisted and wrenched in her grip, the skin of her wrist gone white, shrieking at her that it hurt. Then her face settled into something calm and pleased, and she asked if that was how Huiju wanted it. She set her feet, drew her arm back, and the whole room understood what was coming. Grain had promised a punch. Huiju's last thought was that it seemed to be the floor that killed her. She hoped, as everything went red, that the next life would give her someone strong to be. Somewhere very far from that classroom, a woman in white sat in a hall full of drifting light. And a girl who no longer had a body looked down on all of it gently from above. One egg rested on a wooden cradle, ringed with violets and butterflies, watched by men who wanted a dragon. Someone said the word dragon out loud, and the spirit above the cradle heard it and stopped. The emperor wanted certainty that it would hatch today. The old man beside him counseled patience. The emperor asked what would happen if a bird's head came out of that shell instead. Duke Gilbert protested that such a thing could never happen, sweating through his collar as he said it. Then the hall went white, the shell cracked, and the light came out of it like a struck match. A knight in red and silver turned to look and forgot to close his mouth. In the confetti and the noise, a small white shape lay on the floor, screwing up its face to cry. The emperor named her Eileen Deshea, dragon of the Yulia Empire, guardian of the king. She woke up screaming, red-faced, tangled in linen she could not push off, buried in flowers. Above her, the emperor told Duke Gilbert the egg had been real after all, and that his neck was safe. The newborn kept crying because crying was the only instrument she had been issued, and the emperor declared her the dragon and the crown of Yulia. He would come to regret how much he meant it. The palace she had been born into was the kind of building people cross countries to look at. Petals came down past the window in a slow drift, and nothing in that garden had ever hurt anyone. Her room had a 4-poster bed, patterned tile, and a chair worth more than her old apartment building. She slept in the middle of it, very small, under a canopy meant for someone important. They had written her name out in ink, curling and formal, the way you write something permanent. She decided she liked it. It was the first thing in either life she had been given without a price. Grain Deshea had called herself a dragon and called her a sibling. That arithmetic had only one answer. The beloved dragon of a king. She had no idea that 2 people in this palace had already decided she should die. Then her stomach made a noise, and the entire strategic situation changed. She was hungry, properly hungry, and she had exactly one instrument available for communicating that fact to anybody. Nobody came. Everyone had spent all week calling her precious, and now the room stayed empty. She yelled at the ceiling in the only language she had, and the ceiling did not respond. Eventually, somebody did come in and lay down on the floor beside her cradle, looking thoroughly unbothered by any of it. Outside her window, the sky went on being an untroubled blue, completely indifferent to the crisis unfolding indoors. The palace stood over its green fields exactly as it had the day before. Down in the receiving hall, the maids arranged themselves along the walls and waited for whatever was coming. The room had portraits on every wall and a ceiling carved by someone with far too much time. A young woman in dark blue bowed and called it an honor. Piat, daughter of Viscount Saltern. No one had volunteered to attend the dragon, the emperor said. He hoped she would take the post. She did not answer immediately, and a bead of sweat ran down her jaw. The old duke reminded her that her brother's crime could still be used to erase her whole family. He described the cell they would give her and let her picture it properly. Then he offered the alternative, a pardon for her brother and a chance to restore the family name. He suggested she ought to be kissing the king's feet for an opportunity like this one. Her hand closed on the fabric of her skirt hard enough to crease it. Duke Gilbert, she thought. Old fox. She kept her head down while she thought it. She closed her eyes for a moment and let the last of her own preferences go, quietly, where nobody could see. What came to her instead was a memory, green and loud, from a year when nothing had gone wrong yet. A boy in a dark coat had found her reading under a tree and could not keep his voice down. Will held out something enormous and pink-marbled, grinning like he had won an argument with the world. Piat dropped her book. She knew what it was before he said the word out loud. This was their chance, he told her. Their family would stand at the very top of Yulia. He was freckled and delighted and completely certain, and that was the part she kept remembering. It happened exactly the way he said it would, every single part of it. That was the problem with it. Whoever owns a dragon owns the means to unify the world, and no egg had been found since the last one died. Every king and every noble alive would want it. Piat understood that faster than her brother did. She told him to put it back where he found it. He stared as though she had spoken another language. He knew what she was afraid of, he said, but he could not throw away a chance like this one. He was happy with their life. He only wanted their name in the histories. So she stopped arguing. So he carried the dragon egg to the king himself, with her blessing, because she could not think of a way to stop him. In a hall gone dark, a stone glowed in her hands while she shook. She stood in the crowd with her palm over her mouth, unable to make the scene resolve into something survivable. Was it too much, she wondered, for a family with no power to reach that high? Will was on the floor clutching a wooden case, gray-faced, while a voice above him said he should have known. Guards had him at sword point. The charge was that he had tried to fool the crown with a fake. He shouted that it was real. They showed him the shell, and the dragon's name carved on it had been wiped away. The egg had been real, which meant someone swapped it between the forest and the throne room. An old man behind them dabbed his mouth with a handkerchief and regretted, faintly, having laughed. Piat turned, found Duke Gilbert watching her, and everything after that stopped being a mystery. The great hall was full that day, and every noble in it had come to watch a family be taken apart. Piat stood in the crowd doing the arithmetic that nobody else in the room was willing to do out loud. Then the old duke stepped forward on the red carpet and asked very politely for permission to speak. The emperor warned him that interrupting a trial without good reason cost a man his head. Gilbert smiled and produced it. Piat's stomach dropped somewhere below the floor before her mind had finished working out what she was looking at. Her brother was on his knees between two drawn swords, and 3 men on the stair above him were deciding his life. The emperor leaned on his hand, amused now, the way men get amused when a problem solves itself. Gilbert laughed and lifted the real dragon egg over his head for the whole court to see. Will shouted that it was impossible, and every eye in the room decided he was lying. The blood went out of his face as he finally understood how the swap had been done, and by whom. In the shadows, someone whispered that this would be the end of the Salterns, and enjoyed saying it. He had tried to cheat a king. That was the story the Empire would remember, and stories like that are permanent. Her brother went to prison. Count Gilbert walked out of that hall a duke, and the iron gate of their house closed on a family that no longer had a future behind it. So when the order came, Piat had expected a cell of her own. Nursemaid to a dragon was not on the list. Family honor mattered. Her own life mattered more. She had run out of choices worth defending. So she smiled the smile they wanted from her and said the words they wanted to hear. She knelt before the throne and swore she would do anything. The emperor said anything included dying. Smoothly and safely, he told her. She would raise the dragon until the dragon belonged to him. She bowed her head and remembered it, because remembering it was now the whole of her job. The nursery they gave the dragon had arched windows 2 stories high and a chandelier over the cradle. A blonde boy sat on the carpet with a plate of fruit, trying to get a spoon past a very determined mouth. The baby turned her whole face away from the spoon with enormous commitment, and the fruit went absolutely nowhere. He asked why. Was she not hungry? He had been assured that babies were simple. Inside that small skull, a 19-year-old was demanding real food and being told to eat a balanced diet. So they brought a roast chicken instead, golden and steaming, set down within arm's reach. Her eyes went wide, and then they stayed wide, and every adult in the room noticed it at once. She reached for it with both fists, and the whole room decided she was adorable. She got her arms around the thing and pressed her face into it, radiant, utterly committed. For about 4 seconds, it was the happiest she had been across 2 entire lifetimes. Then she tried to chew and discovered that she had been issued a mouth with no teeth in it. She could have finished 2 chickens by herself once. Now the chicken sat in front of her and stayed there. It was, she decided, somewhere behind those enormous gold eyes entirely worth crying about. So she did, at volume, while the boy panicked and asked whether the food was simply too delicious. The wailing went out into the corridor, and the doors it opened would decide who ended up guarding her. A maid came in at a run with an older woman right behind her, both of them already braced for disaster. They stopped in the doorway because the disaster in question was a baby and a chicken. Somebody shouted for Prince Eric, and 2 women in white came across the room fast. A silver-haired man asked the boy if he was hurt. Eric told Jesslyn he was perfectly fine. Piat watched all of this from the side with sweat running down her cheek. Because the child screaming her lungs out was the most valuable creature in the Empire, and it was on her ledger. A woman scooped the baby up and said the prince should not be here, that this was dangerous. Eric asked again, honestly puzzled, whether she was crying because the chicken was too good. The baby howled that this was absolutely not the reason, in a language nobody in the room could hear. She wanted to eat, and she could not, and there was no word for that yet. The woman said it had gone cold, and that if the emperor learned the prince had been here, she would not be safe. Then she turned to Piat and told her that this room was her responsibility and to guard it properly. Eric waved from the doorway and promised he would come back, and the door closed behind him. She had expected something far more frightening than a hungry baby. She would learn much later that she had simply arrived early. What she had instead was a baby with huge gold eyes, demanding at the top of her voice to be fed. She looked ordinary. That was the mistake everyone in that palace was about to make. That night, the moon hung over the palace in a clean crescent and the gardens were quiet. Leaves came loose in the dark and turned over in the air with nobody watching them. Except that someone was watching. A shape in a black cloak sat in the branches above the guards' lanterns. Below, 3 men in armor talked about how much of their shift was left. The moon went behind a bank of cloud, and the whole garden quietly lost its edges in the dark. A door opened somewhere it should not have, and a figure crossed a room lit only by window light. The cradle stood alone on the patterned tile with its shadow stretched long behind it. The intruder looked down into it and asked, almost disappointed, whether this was really it. They had paid a great deal of money, he said, to have something this small killed in its sleep. And the something this small opened her eyes and wondered where Piat had gone. The blade came up over the cradle. A single red eye showed above the mask, and it was not in any hurry. She recognized a sword before she recognized a face, and understood with total clarity that she was about to die again. The point came down towards her fast enough to blur, and there was nobody else in the room to stop it. Her eyes changed. Something behind them, older than she was, opened for a second. Fire came out of her throat and went across the room, and the man in the cloak learned what a dragon is. He staggered back, beating at his sleeve, laughing that of course it had been too easy. He drew his sword properly this time, meaning to finish the job before anyone in the palace came running. The door came off its latch behind him, and someone came through it with a sword already moving. A boy's voice, cold and unimpressed, asked whether he was really trying to kill a baby. He told the assassin to step away from the cradle, and did not wait for an answer. The masked man screamed, more from fury than pain, and swung to meet him. It ended against a wall in a pattern that ran down the plaster and pooled on the floor. Piat came back through the door and stopped, both hands over her mouth, shaking. The knife lay on the tile with the blood still leaving it, drop by drop. The boy turned. There was a cut across his face, and he asked her where she had been. Prince Robert stood there holding the dragon in one arm and a red sword in the other, 10 years old. He asked again, and this time it was not a question so much as a charge. She stammered that she knew what this baby meant to the Empire, and that his back was bleeding through his coat. He told her to fetch the guard and to say nothing about this to anyone, because he intended to find out who paid. She protested that surely they had to report an attack on the palace. He said no. Show a weakness once, he told her, and the next one comes through the same hole. He would strengthen the watch instead. Then he held out the baby and asked her to take the child. The woman thanked him for protecting Eileen. He said only that he had heard a noise and come. Then he turned and walked out the way he had come, still bleeding through his coat, still perfectly composed. At the door, he apologized for being harsh with her and asked her to protect the baby. Piat swore she would. By morning, the glass house was full of blue butterflies, and none of it looked like a place where anyone had died. Piat wheeled the cradle through the flowers and said it was a beautiful day, and that they would be more careful now. She was talking about last night. The baby in the cradle understood every word of it. Eileen had not known she could do that. She turned the thought over. She had breathed fire because she was a dragon. She decided she ought to practice somewhere private. Then Piat stopped walking, and the cradle stopped with her. Ahead of them, a cup came down onto a saucer with a small, unmistakable click. Prince Robert was sitting in the glass house taking tea, alone, with his back very straight. Piat panicked quietly, wondering whether he would take a stroll as an insult after last night. She decided the polite thing was to turn the cradle around and leave before he noticed them. The wheels made a small grinding noise on the stone path, and the prince at the tea table noticed them. So there was tea, poured out under the glass roof with cakes nobody was going to eat. Piat took her cup with both hands and did not trust herself to hold it with one. She thanked him. Inside, she was screaming that she was having tea with a prince. He asked whether it was safe for them to be walking about like this. She said they only did it on quiet days. There could be an assassin in any hedge, he said, and looked out at the roses as though counting them. He called the baby fragile. The baby listening took considerable offense at the word. Then someone came running down the path calling both their names, delighted to have found company. Prince Eric arrived at speed through the rose beds, wanting to know if he could have tea as well. Robert closed his eyes with the specific exhaustion of an older brother and asked if Eric had escaped again. Jesslyn could not keep him anywhere, he said, but escaping constantly was still a problem. Eric was not listening. He was leaning into the cradle asking the dragon to be his little sister. When Robert objected, Eric announced that his brother was being mean to him, which was not the argument Robert expected. Robert told him to remember his manners, that he was a prince, and that nobody befriends a boy who talks like that. A pair of white shoes stopped on the gravel behind them, and the argument died in the air. Eric went pale under his freckles. Robert set his cup down onto the saucer without letting it make a sound. Sophia, queen of the Yulia Empire, stood in the roses with a white parasol and asked what they were doing here. She said she was very disappointed in Robert, and she said it in front of the servants on purpose. She had told him many times to be kind to his brother, and look at him. Robert began to say he had not been unkind. Eric stood beside him and said nothing at all. So Robert stopped, bowed his head, and asked forgiveness. It would not happen again. The queen said she would be watching him, and let the silence sit until he understood it. Eric stared at the ground, guilt written all over him, knowing exactly whose fault this was. Then he asked brightly whether whoever holds a dragon can unify the world, and his mother stopped smiling. The parasol tilted. The queen said her son seemed very interested in dragons and smiled. There was a saying like that, she agreed. It was why his father had wanted one so badly. She stroked his hair and asked him where this dragon of his was supposed to be. And Eric, who had never once been taught to be careful, pointed straight at the cradle. The parasol tilted a little further, and the queen asked her son whether he had actually met the thing. He said, of course, she was right there, and asked why nobody else had seen her. Inside the cradle, Eileen understood with perfect clarity that something very bad was about to happen to somebody. The queen said if that was it, then this must be Piat. Piat bowed and called it an honor. The queen looked at her for a long moment and said she must want very badly to die. Piat's hands began shaking around the parasol handle, and she could not make them stop. She had brought this dangerous thing within arm's reach of both princes. What exactly had she been thinking? The word dragon came out of that mouth like something scraped off a shoe. And the dragon, 3 months old, looked up and finally saw the Queen of Yulia properly. It was in her eyes. There was no misreading it, no softening it, and no bargaining with it. She had heard this was an unnatural creature, the queen said, and now she could see it for herself. Eileen shrieked at the top of her infant lungs, and the sky above the glass house went white with it. Keep this thing away from the princes, the queen told her, and if it ever begins to darken, do not hesitate. Piat looked into a pair of very calm blue eyes and heard the rest of the sentence coming. Cut its throat with the enchanted blade. Eileen heard every word of it from inside the cradle. Kill it, said the Queen of Yulia, and in all the years that followed, she would never once take those words back. And then she breathed fire straight up into the face of the Queen of the Yulia Empire. Sophia went backwards into the roses, hair smoking, screaming a word that was not a word. The story got all the way around the palace before the smell of burnt hair had finished leaving the garden. Someone put a cup down hard enough to spill it, laughing too much to hold it steady. A red-bearded man in a fine room was hammering the table, roaring about the baby dragon. From the bed, Eileen pointed out that she now had a target painted on her back and asked what was funny. Piat, holding her, said she was extremely good at rolling over, which was not the compliment Eileen wanted. Eileen asked the ceiling whether this man had anything at all to do, and considered breathing fire to move him along. Sir Temerin, Knight Commander of Yulia, announced that he was always busy because the king trusted him with everything. So he had nothing to do, Piat concluded, and asked whether he was not the least bit afraid of Eileen. He laughed out loud at the very idea of it. That baby dragon, frightening a grown knight? He gestured at the small creature sitting in a nest of pastel cushions like a decorative pillow. "Look at those cheeks," he said. "Those arms. Those eyes." Eileen was thrown by being complimented for once. "Excellent," said Piat. Then he could mind her for a little while. Both of them stopped smiling at once. He demanded to know what she meant. She said the head maid wanted her and it would not take long. The door shut. The Knight Commander of the Empire was left holding a baby, and both of them screamed. He ended up on the floor with her in his lap, sweating, telling her that Piat would be right back. But what, he asked nobody, was he supposed to do if she started crying? Eileen looked up at the man holding her and wondered who exactly he imagined was about to start crying. He asked whether she could possibly stay still, and she stopped moving out of sheer surprise. He said that if he had a niece, she would probably be like this, and wondered aloud whether he was getting old. Then the door banged and he nearly dropped her, and shouted that Piat had almost cost him his life. Piat was the color of paper. She said without any of the usual softening that the king had returned. He was on his way here to see Eileen right now, and he had never once come before. Eileen sat up straight. This time, she thought, she was going to make a good impression. She had already been a target once, in the dark, with a knife over the cradle. And now the queen of the entire empire had decided she hated her, at first sight, in front of witnesses. She lay in her cradle looking out at the gardens and worked the problem the way she had worked school timetables. She did not know who was a friend and who was an enemy, so she needed the single strongest shield in the building. And the strongest shield in the building wore a crown, a fur mantle, and the right to end any argument in the empire. She would do absolutely anything, she decided, for one comfortable life without a knife in it. Piat pronounced her presentable and said the king would be surprised when he saw her, which was the whole plan. Then she mentioned there was a gift, and Eileen forgot the plan entirely, a gift from Prince Eric. The box opened on a hair clip that threw light around the room like a small captured star. He had wanted to bring it himself, Piat said, but the queen's order had stopped him at the door, and he had asked her to call him brother next time. Piat pinned it in her hair and told her she looked lovely, and Eileen's heart went embarrassingly fast. Outside in the corridor, a voice announced that His Majesty the Emperor would be entering the room now. He came in with 2 attendants bowing behind him, and the room reorganized itself around his coat. Piat curtsied deep and said they had been waiting for him, which was true in more ways than she meant. He observed mildly, and without looking at anyone in particular, that it had been almost a full month. Then he sat and asked how the dragon was doing in the tone a man uses about an investment. Piat looked up at him from her curtsy and found that something in the man's face had changed completely. He asked her whether this was really the wrinkled little thing from before and did not finish the sentence well. She said yes, it was, and asked him very carefully whether there was some kind of problem with that. He said no, absolutely not, nothing at all, in the voice of a man caught doing something. The baby in the chair laughed up at him with her arms out, wearing a red bow, and he was completely undone. Piat asked him to repeat himself. He said never mind. He had been talking to himself. She was growing faster than he expected, he said. Was that because she was not human? Piat said she was growing quickly because she ate well, slept well, and played well, and he accepted this. Then the baby started making a noise, and both adults stopped to listen to it. She was pointing at him, beaming, absolutely determined to land the shot on her first attempt. And the word that came out of her mouth, in front of the maids, unmistakably and at volume, was daddy. The Emperor of Yulia stood over a cradle with his mouth open and no idea what to do with his hands. She said it again in case he had missed it, pointing at him with total confidence. He turned around and demanded to know whether she had just called him her father. Piat explained that Mama and Papa are simply easy sounds for babies, that it meant nothing, and begged him not to be angry. He repeated the words nothing at all back at her, and looked genuinely wounded by them. Eileen watched him deflate and thought, with satisfaction, that it clearly meant something after all. She had been trying to trigger his paternal instincts, and the results were already exceeding projections. Piat conceded that the child did seem to like him, which was the sentence he had been waiting for. She asked whether he wanted to hold her. He said, and did not say no. She offered the baby, saying of course he did not have to. He took her, and the politics of Yulia quietly changed. He told himself it was strategy. Tame the thing while it is small and it stays tame. Piat turned away towards the window and let herself smile properly, where the Emperor could not see it. He said he remembered holding Eric and Robert like this, and Eileen decided the plan was working. He laughed and told her he was not her father, while holding her exactly the way a father does. Good, good, he said over and over, and the room felt warmer than it had in months. Then he asked Piat, still smiling down at the child, whether everything here had been going well lately. And Piat's face went still, because she had been dreading this question for 2 weeks. She said she did not know how to say it, and then said it. There had been an assassin. She had gone for milk. Prince Robert had come through the door in time, and that was the only reason Eileen was alive. He had learned from the best swordsman in the Empire, the Emperor said slowly, and did not finish the other half. He wanted to know whether the man had been captured, and who had paid him. By the time she got back with the milk, Piat said, Robert had already killed the man himself. The Emperor looked away, and for the first time that day he was not thinking about a dragon at all. This was a dragon, he said, and she was still far too small to keep herself alive. He told Piat that raising a child alone was not reasonable, and that he would send her help. He had found a person who knew about dragons. She thanked him and did not ask what kind of person that was. The study doors came open hard enough to rattle every crystal on the chandelier above them. Someone was shouting for the Emperor from the corridor, and Piat's shoulders went up around her ears. Duke Gilbert arrived out of breath, saying he had been looking everywhere, and Eileen's mood dropped through the floor. He turned on Piat and demanded to know how a maid dared stand in the same room as the king. That, Eileen noted, was Duke Gilbert, the one that not a single servant in this palace could stand. The Emperor asked what was so urgent. Gilbert said someone suspicious had come to the castle gates. The man claimed to have been summoned by the crown, and he looked poor, and he appeared to be drunk. But the seal on his letter was genuine, so they had held him rather than throw him out. A drunk carrying a royal seal. He decided to see for himself, not knowing he was about to hire the only person alive who understood what Eileen was. So the gates opened, and the guards walked a hooded figure up the long path through the gardens. 2 soldiers muttered to each other that the king had genuinely cleared this person to enter the palace. The hooded figure hiccuped, asked cheerfully whether they could go in now, and was told they would be watched. That, came the answer with a small crooked smile, would depend entirely on how everyone behaved. They went in together under the stone arches, past the guards, and the palace closed over them like water. Upstairs, the Emperor turned the letter over and confirmed the seal on it was his own. Which meant, he said, that the person standing in his study was the one who had been writing to him. About 5 letters, came the reply. The dragon tamer had arrived and gave the name Kiwi. The Emperor sat back, looked at this creature in his study, and decided it was interesting. Kiwi cut straight through the pleasantries and said they should get to the point. Duke Gilbert exploded, demanding to know whether this person had any idea who they were talking to. Show respect to the king, he shouted and jabbed a finger at the floor as if that settled it. Kiwi asked whether he could not see they were in the middle of a conversation, and asked the Emperor if he wanted his feet kissed. The Emperor told Gilbert that was enough, and that he wanted to talk with this person alone. The Duke went stiff, said Your Majesty in a strangled voice, and had to stand there and take it. So, said the Emperor, the name is Kiwi. Kiwi confirmed it, grinning, entirely unbothered. Then back to the point, he said, folding his hands. Where exactly is this dragon of mine being kept? Kiwi said that could not be answered yet because trust runs both directions, and asked if this was a test. He had asked Kiwi to come here, which meant he needed help. That was the whole of the argument. Kiwi laid it out plainly. Keep the Yulia Empire strong, and make the dragon his. That, Kiwi said, was something within reach. The Emperor said nothing for a long moment. Then he sat forward over the desk, looked at this filthy stranger properly and said, "All right, let us see." Was this person seriously standing in his study and claiming to be able to control a living dragon? Out came a leash and a collar, inherited from a grandmother, with an assurance that taming animals was the family trade. The Emperor asked whether those were actually going to be used, and Kiwi asked whether that was a problem. He said the dragon was small and weak, and the words came out before he could stop them. Kiwi stared at him with a face full of question marks. This was not the reaction the job usually got. Not yet, Kiwi allowed, but eventually. And nobody would be harsh with the dragon in the meantime. "Fine," said the Emperor. "Make sure she knows who I am and remembers me, but do not let her get hurt. Do that, and there would be fame and fortune without limit waiting at the other end." Kiwi said that made it a deal, and asked whether there was anything else he wanted to add. There was one last thing, the Emperor said, before either of them left the room. He did not want the child smelling whatever was currently coming off this person. Take a bath. Kiwi went scarlet, insisted the smell was only the drink, and swore to bathing regularly as a rule. Outside, the fountains went on running in the sun, and the palace waited for its newest employee. Days passed quietly over the old rooftops, which in that place was always a warning sign. Tea sat going cold on a marble table under an open window, and nobody had touched the cakes beside it. Piat had her eyes shut and a small smile on her face, holding something in her lap. She had fallen asleep sitting upright, the way people do when they have not slept properly in weeks. The room was completely still. Everything in it was breathing slowly, except for the baby in the chair. Eileen sat in her red chair, bored out of her mind, and thought about how badly she wanted a webtoon. It was peaceful. She had learned by now that peaceful was a thing that happened between other things. She stared up at the ceiling and wondered whether she ought to practice breathing fire again. She had tried it once or twice since. The trouble was that she could not aim it. Piat was asleep in the chair. This was, in Eileen's considered professional judgment, the perfect window of opportunity. She tried to remember how she had done it the first time, and the memory came back with a knife attached. She had been frightened then, and she had been startled, and underneath both of those, something else. She thought about the queen's face saying cut its throat, and the heat came up her throat on its own. Her eyes shut, and something at the very back of her mouth began unmistakably to burn. Her throat was tickling and going hot, and she gripped the cushion and thought, "This is it." Then it occurred to her that she had not decided where to point it. She clamped her mouth shut and held it in, shaking, going redder by the second. Her whole face screwed up. It was like trying to swallow a lit match. She could not hold it. It came out of her in a column, straight across the room. Something bright and burning went past the furniture at speed and hit whatever was on the other side. Water spread out across the patterned tile with broken glass sitting in it, catching what light was left. Piat came out of the chair screaming, grabbed hold of the nearest solid thing, and looked for the child. The curtains were burning. Piat still had no idea that the thing which started the fire was in her own arms. It was lucky, she said afterwards, that there had been water in the glass. She asked whether this was another attack. She turned the baby over in her hands, looking for burns, and got no explanation at all. Then the baby hiccuped, and a small puff of smoke came out with it. She hiccuped again, and again. Each one arrived with a little more smoke than the last. Piat looked at her for a long moment and asked in a flat voice whether she had done this. Eileen hiccuped a third time and put both hands over her mouth, which answered the question completely. Piat said it was amazing that she could already breathe fire and did not sound entirely amazed. Then light came from the doorway and she turned with the baby held tight against her. Someone had come in without a sound and was already close enough to touch them. A voice asked whether this was the dragon, Eileen Deshea. Piat demanded to know who was asking. The stranger bowed low on the red carpet and apologized sincerely for having frightened either of them. She said her grandmother had described this child but had undersold her and gave her name as Kiwi. The old clock in the corner went on ticking while 3 people in that room recalibrated everything. The king had sent her, she said. Her grandmother had been nursemaid to the dragon Grain and had trained her. Eileen heard the name Grain and nearly fell over. That awful woman, again, reaching into this life too. She could not get away from her. 200 years, 2 lifetimes, and still the same family shadow. Kiwi said she had grown up learning how to tame dragons, what to feed them, and how to train them. And Piat stopped her right there, and asked why she was talking about a child as though she were an animal. Kiwi blinked at her, honestly confused, and asked what she was supposed to call it. Piat stood in the wreck of the room with the baby in her arms and did not answer for a while. She looked straight up at Kiwi with her jaw set, still holding the child, and did not blink. Whatever she was about to say, she had clearly been holding it since the day she took this post. "Yes," she said, "she is a dragon, but she matters to me, so be careful with her." Kiwi shrugged, said she would go along with that for now, and left the argument unfinished. Then she stopped, squinted, and tilted her head at something in the baby's hair. She asked if she could see that. Eileen informed her, with dignity, that she was nobody's sister. Kiwi said that was not important and asked again about the hair clip. Piat said it was a gift from Prince Eric. "That is not a hair clip," Kiwi said. "That is a magic stone, and it may well be enchanted." She turned the little stone over in the light, humming to herself, and her face stopped being cheerful. Eileen grabbed it back and announced that it was hers, and Kiwi did not argue the point. Then something small and blonde came through the door at a dead run, and Piat backed up fast. Eileen recognized that shout instantly and knew that whatever came through the door behind it was going to make everything worse. Kiwi turned around with the pleasant expression of a person about to be tackled. Someone demanded to know who this kid was, and got told he was not just any kid. Prince Eric came off the top of the stairs shouting that he was a prince and calling her an arsonist. Kiwi went white and asked what on earth this small, furious person was talking about and got kicked for it. The answer arrived as a flying kick, delivered by a 7-year-old at full commitment. She went down with her eyes shut and her arms up, entirely unprepared for palace life. Behind them, the fire in the hearth burned on, and the curtains kept moving in the draft. Eric stood over her with his fists shaking, roaring that he had caught the arsonist, and Kiwi decided she hated this place. The next morning, Eileen was handed something and asked to be enthusiastic about it. Kiwi had brought a notebook, its pages crammed with faded handwriting from a woman 2 generations dead. She had a pencil behind her ear, a plaster on her cheek from yesterday, and said this was for her. The page she opened to had been titled in a careful hand, "Eileen's Baby Food." Kiwi announced with genuine delight, the way people announce weather, that her teeth were finally coming in. Which meant weaning. Eileen looked into the bowl and asked whether that gray substance was seriously the plan. She demanded Piat. Kiwi said Piat was away reporting yesterday's incident and would not be rescuing anyone. Eileen stuck her tongue out at the bowl and requested, with feeling, literally anything else in the building. Kiwi asked how long she intended to live on milk and told her to try 1 spoonful. It did not look good, she admitted, but it smelled fine. Eileen made a non-committal noise. "Just 1 spoon," Kiwi said, grinning at her, and held it out across the table like a dare. Eileen's stomach betrayed her with a growl loud enough for both of them to hear. She took the spoon herself, held it over the steaming bowl, and told herself that hunger had beaten better people than her. The first mouthful was, to her genuine astonishment, delicious enough to be worth the humiliation of admitting it. She swallowed, opened her eyes, and decided that she was going to finish the entire bowl right now. Down the long red corridor, somebody was walking back with a basket over one arm and nothing on her mind. Piat pushed open the door, said she was back, and stopped with one foot still in the hallway. She wrinkled her nose at the air in the room and asked what that smell was supposed to be. Kiwi pointed proudly at the empty bowl and announced that Eileen had cleaned out every last spoonful of it. "Of course she had," Kiwi said. "Every dragon that has ever lived adores this particular dish." Piat asked whether she was joking and whether she had genuinely fed a baby a bowl of snake stew. The word snake went through Eileen like ice water, and the whole room seemed to tilt sideways around her. Piat grabbed her off the chair and demanded to know whether snake was actually safe for a dragon to eat. "Trust her," Kiwi said cheerfully. The child had enjoyed every mouthful. What else did dragons like anyway? "Nothing unusual," she said. "Snake, frog eyes, spider legs, centipede, rat tail, and the occasional caterpillar." Piat asked in horror whether the child could not eat normal food, and was told dragons eat everything. This was just nourishing. "Then why," Piat demanded, "feed her snake stew at all?" Kiwi shrugged and admitted she had done it for fun. For fun. Eileen sat in Piat's arms with the taste still in her mouth and considered breathing fire on principle. Then Kiwi's face changed, and she said there was one more thing she ought to mention while she remembered. There was, she said, exactly one thing they were going to have to be careful about. Piat asked what. Kiwi hesitated, rubbed the back of her head, and said her grandmother had told her this one. Once a dragon tastes human flesh, she said, there is no going back from it. Piat's face emptied out. She repeated the words human flesh very quietly, as though saying them softly made them smaller. Kiwi said she thought her grandmother had told her that because it had happened before, to somebody. Every dragon is different, she added, so it might not apply here. She did not sound convinced of that. Piat looked down and found the baby had gone limp against her shoulder, half asleep and heavy. Night came in over the palace with the stars out, and the room went quiet around a sleeping child. While she was drifting off, a question came to her that would not let go. Which dragon had eaten a person? And more to the point, what had a person done to make it want to? She was smiling in her sleep and had no idea what she was walking towards. The dark behind her eyes turned into something else, wide and starlit and full of drifting light. She was floating in it in her nightdress, and her small body did not seem to weigh anything at all. And she wondered, the way you wonder in dreams, what kind of dragon she would grow up to be. Then a voice said her name out of the dark, twice, and it was not a voice belonging to this life at all. She turned over, still smiling, still not understanding that she was no longer alone in there. Something enormous leaned down towards her out of the glittering dust, scaled and slow and patient. She looked up into that enormous shape, and every single part of her went perfectly still. The dragon looked back down at her with gold eyes and said that she was awake now. She asked whether that was a dragon. It said it knew she was confused and asked her to listen carefully. It lowered its great head to the grass beside her and said that its name was Eileen Deshea. And then it said the sentence that mattered. I am you, in your previous life. Her mouth opened. The words previous life landed somewhere behind her ribs and stuck there. 3 crowned shapes stood facing one another in a hall lit like a cathedral, and none of them looked kind. A girl in a white dress sat in the middle of the starlight with her hands in her lap, waiting for something. A tear went down her face, and beside her an earring lay on the ground where it had fallen. Then the dream turned red, and there were bodies coming down through the dark. A man knelt in the mud looking at his own bleeding hands with an arrow through the ground beside him. A woman in a white dress stood out in the rain with blood on the hem, gripping her skirts hard enough to tear them. Someone said he was sorry and shut his eyes so he would not have to watch what came next. A man in a white coat spoke in the downpour, and the man beside him was holding a knife low and ready. Then the rain became sweat, and the woman in white became a small child burning up on a pink pillow. Eileen came awake with tears on her face and could not remember where the dream had stopped. Piat was leaning over her, asking whether she was all right, whether it had only been a nightmare. It had not. She was sick, properly sick, and she could barely lift her head off the linen. Piat spun around the room, knocked into the chair, and could not decide which thing to do first. She got a hand on the child's forehead and said softly and horribly that she was burning. She shouted the girl's name and got no reply, only shallow breathing and a face gone dark red. Outside the windows, the fountains kept playing, and the roses did not care what was happening indoors. Sunlight came through the arched glass onto a room that had stopped being peaceful hours ago. A hand lifted a bowl of clean water, and the drops came off the rim one at a time. The child slept badly on the couch, flushed, sweating, too hot to touch comfortably. And a man with long brown hair sat beside her in silence, and there were tears on his face. The Emperor demanded to know what had happened, and whether anyone had sent for Dr. Haber yet. Kiwi had gone to fetch him, Piat said, and began to say something about the water, and stopped. He asked her to guess at a cause. She said it might have been something the child had eaten. He asked what. She said the words, snake stew, and he was out of the chair before she finished them. She gave up Kiwi's name in under a second, and would spend a long time afterwards wondering what that second had cost her. He roared at her, demanding to know what exactly they had fed the most important creature in his empire. Piat bowed her head and asked forgiveness, and did not offer any of the excuses she had prepared. Then a shadow fell across both of them, and they turned towards the door together. Kiwi arrived at a run with the doctor behind her, calling out that she had heard she was wanted. Out beyond the windows, the palace sat in the sun, looking exactly as safe as it had yesterday. Dr. Haber bent over the bed while 3 people stood behind him and tried not to breathe. He said he was sorry, but he healed humans, not dragons. Still, he thought this was a digestion problem. If that was all it was, the Emperor said, then they had been extremely fortunate, and his voice cracked on it. Then Piat asked, hesitantly, whether she might say something. He told her to go ahead. The dragon's health mattered, she said. But she was worried about him too. He was soaked to the skin. He looked down at himself and realized he was standing in his own study dripping onto the carpet. It was exactly as the man said. He had run here from wherever he had been without stopping for a coat. He had lost his head the moment he heard she was ill and had simply run to her bedroom to see her. When had it started, he wondered. He remembered a small hand and a laugh and hearts in the air. He covered his mouth, furious with himself, and thought the words, "This child is cute," like an accusation. Or perhaps it had started earlier, with a red bow and a laugh in a room full of roses. Or perhaps it had been the exact moment she looked up at him and called him her father. Piet asked whether he was quite well. He said yes, far too quickly, and would not look at her. His eyes stayed fixed on the child on the couch, and something in him had already decided. Piet watched him and quietly filed away the fact that the Emperor of Yulia had a weakness now. The palace woke up the next morning as though nothing had happened, which is what palaces do. In the sick room, a woman had fallen asleep upright in a chair, and something touched her hand. Piet surfaced, remembered she had passed out sitting there, and found she was still holding a small cloth doll. Eileen sat up on her own, patted herself down, and reported that the fever had gone and her legs worked. Then she noticed something on the blanket beside her and went very quiet about it. 2 hands were holding each other on the blanket, one small and one not, and neither had let go all night. She looked up at the woman in the maid's uniform who had not slept, and could not think of anything to say. Her eyes went enormous, and she understood something she had been refusing to understand for months. Kiwi was slumped in the corner, making a noise like a dying kettle, and Robert was sitting bolt upright beside her. And there was a hand resting on her blanket that belonged to a man who ruled an empire. All of them had been worried about her. In 2 entire lifetimes, that had never once happened before. Piet yawned enormously, then froze because the child was staring at her with wet eyes. She asked herself out loud when exactly she had fallen asleep, and then registered that Eileen was upright. Eileen threw both arms in the air and wished her a good morning at a volume that woke the whole corridor. Later, Piet carried her out to the glass house, saying she had wanted a walk the instant she opened her eyes. Robert watched them come down the path and admitted privately that his worry had probably been wasted. A 1-year-old who talked and walked, Kiwi said, and suggested the snake stew deserved some of the credit. Piet declined to credit the snake stew, but conceded the child had never been more full of energy. She crouched down, took both small hands, and reminded her this was her first time walking properly. Then she let go, 1 finger at a time, and stepped backwards across the tiles. 2 red shoes stood alone on the stone, wobbling, taking the whole weight of a very determined person. Eileen put her arms out for balance and made a noise of pure alarm. Then her mouth fell open because she was standing, and nobody was holding her up. She threw both arms wide in the middle of the flowers and announced to the entire garden that she had done it. She started towards Kiwi and Robert at speed, and both of them shouted at her to slow down before she fell. She insisted she was fine, wobbling badly, absolutely refusing to be carried for even 1 more day. Then something cold went down the back of her neck, and she stopped walking. She had no word for the feeling. It arrived from nowhere, and it did not belong in a garden. The sky went dark in her eyes, and every hair stood up, because something out there had already chosen her. Behind her, Robert was asking whether they should buy her shoes, and Kiwi was telling him not to spoil her. They were arguing about the Emperor spoiling her when someone started to say wait and did not finish. Kiwi's eyes shut. She had heard something come through the air that should not have been there. Robert screamed her name across the whole length of the garden with everything his lungs had in them. A black line came at her out of the flower beds faster than a 1-year-old can turn around. She looked up and saw the arrow, and there was no possible world in which she moved in time. Piet was already running and already too far away, shouting her name at the top of her lungs. A boot came down hard on the tile in the space between the child and whatever was coming for her. Robert had crossed the entire garden without appearing to have decided to do it at any point. He shouted at Piet to protect her and put himself in the space where the arrow was going. His eyes tracked something the others had not seen yet, somewhere back behind the flowers. He drew and brought the blade up in one motion, and he was 10 years old. He roared at the hedges to show themselves, and the arrow came apart against his sword with a crack. Eileen stared at him with her mouth open and thought, with enormous feeling, that Robert was magnificent. He said he had not seen where it came from, and Piet repeated the question on her knees behind him. He told everyone to get down and out of sight and judged there were only 1 or 2 shooters out there. Eileen crouched behind him with her hands over her mouth and wondered when this life would give her one peaceful week. Behind a brick wall at the edge of the garden, a single violet eye was watching the boy with the sword. The assassin had heard the prince was good with a blade and was pleased to find the rumor accurate. He did not think the boy knew where he was standing, so he saw no reason to be careful about it. He was wrong. Robert had already turned towards him and was looking directly at the wall. The boy came off the steps with the sword up and the distance closed before the second arrow was nocked. Robert called out that it had come from behind the flower bed, that he had seen it, and asked what now. Steel cracked against wood, and the archer discovered he had misjudged the range badly. The eyes above the mask went wide for the first time in what had been a very easy afternoon. A boot hit the stone, and by the time the sound arrived, the boy was already somewhere else entirely. Robert dropped low with his fist closed and decided he would end this before anyone else got hurt. The archer swung the bow like a club and caught him across the face with it. An arrow came past close enough that Robert saw the fletching go by his eye. He demanded to know who had sent the man and got a laugh instead of an answer. The assassin asked almost warmly whether the boy was really only 10 years old and said he was impressed. Then the mask stopped being amused and the fight turned into something else entirely. Violet eyes narrowed above the cloth, and there was no more admiration in them at all. Robert's head snapped sideways under the blow, and blood came off his face into the flower beds. A boot came down on his chest and drove him into the tile with everything behind it. He screamed once, and the sound went up into the glass roof and came back down on everyone below. The red spots on the white floor joined themselves into a trail, and the man following that trail had still not said what he came for. The assassin told him he was good, told him to stay down, and stood over him while he coughed. Piat clutched the baby against her and shouted his name and his title in the same broken breath. Somewhere else in the palace, a young man in gray stood at a window and had no idea any of this was happening. Heels came across the bloodied floor without hurrying, because there was nothing left to hurry for. The assassin remarked that the boy had very nearly had him, which was not a compliment he gave often. Robert got up onto one elbow, grinning through the blood, and swore he would kill him if he touched the child. He was told to stop talking with a cracked skull, and complimented sincerely on not having passed out yet. Then he went down again, and the assassin asked whether they ought to begin the whole thing over. And then the masked man looked past the bleeding prince and said 2 words, "Dragon Eileen." A voice from the top of the steps shouted at him to wait, and everyone in the garden turned. Piat put herself in front of the child and said that anyone who wanted Eileen would have to go through her. He could not wait to see her in person, he said. He had sent an idiot last time, and it had gone badly. Eileen understood in one sentence that the knife over her cradle had been bought and paid for by this man. He said he had no intention of killing her, because killing her that easily would be a waste. She was a dragon after all. And then he came down the path at them at a full sprint. Piat turned her back on him and folded herself around the child, which was all she had left to offer. Eileen looked up over her shoulder and saw the blade already leaving his hand. The sword went through the air across the entire width of the glass house, turning as it flew. It struck, and the ground broke, and the sound of it emptied every bird out of the garden. Piat opened her eyes and found herself still holding something warm, and entirely unharmed. Above the mask, the single visible eye had gone completely still, and stayed that way for a long moment. Eileen sat up in the dust with both hands at her collar, and understood what had just been proven. He had thrown a sword at a child purely to find out whether she was really a dragon or not. Piat gathered her up and stared at the man on the path, unable to make her hands stop shaking. Then a voice behind them told everyone to stop and asked the assassin whether he would kindly calm down. Kiwi stood at the top of the stair with a crossbow already drawn and pointed at his head. She said he had known perfectly well that ordinary steel does nothing to a dragon before he ever threw it. He had wanted confirmation, she said. He had got it. Now he could leave. And she asked him, smiling over the string, which he thought was faster, his weapon or his skull. He raised both hands under the glass roof and admitted, without much regret, that he had lost. Then he asked whether that made everyone happy now, in the tone of a man who is not finished. Something small was closed inside his fist, and Kiwi's eyes went straight to it. He agreed pleasantly that at this range he could not dodge whatever she was holding. So, he asked her in the friendliest possible voice, could she not simply let him walk away from this? She pointed out that he had attacked them first and told him the answer to that was absolutely not. He hummed, tilted his head, and said no, he supposed not, as though he had only been checking. Then he said he had no choice, and Kiwi shouted at him to show what was in his hand. He opened his fingers and did it his own way instead, exactly as he had been planning to all along. The light went white and the sound arrived a half-second later, and everyone in the garden went blind. The last thing anyone saw clearly was a pair of violet eyes watching them, entirely unhurried. When the smoke cleared, there was rain coming down through a hole in the glasshouse roof and no assassin. By evening, the council chamber had learned that there had been a bomb in the imperial garden, and that the dragon of Yulia had been attacked inside the palace walls for the second time. The emperor was on his feet with his fist in the air, saying the man had broken in and simply walked out again. This was a threat and an insult to Yulia, he said. He still had no idea which empire had actually sent it. Kiwi noted he had come in during the change of the guard, and that other countries would learn about Eileen soon anyway. Then announce it first, the emperor said, and let them all learn it from him instead. From that day she would not have to hide, he decided. Visible and protected was safer than hidden and hunted. He turned to the red-bearded knight and ordered him to protect Eileen. Sir Temerin accepted on the spot. Eileen sat through all of it feeling sick because Robert was upstairs bleeding on her account. Duke Gilbert rounded on her and demanded to know how a creature like her dared to worry about a prince. The emperor told him to shut his mouth. The duke went the color of paper and begged forgiveness. He clutched his own collar and complained to nobody that his majesty had become so cold lately. Then he looked at the group across the room and wondered aloud whether the evil dragon had put a spell on him. Kiwi watched him go and said quietly that she did not have a good feeling about that old man. Later there was a knock and word that both princes were asking to see the emperor, together unusually. He said to let them in, and the doors opened onto something nobody in the room expected. Eric came in first with his head down, and Robert came behind him and asked to be excused for intruding. Piat said his name in relief, seeing him upright. The emperor asked him what this was about. Robert said he had come to be punished because he had failed to protect Eileen and had let the man escape. Kiwi objected that this had been no ordinary assassin, and that it would have gone far worse without him. That, the emperor said, was what she thought. It was not what the boy in front of him thought. Robert kept his head down and did not move, because losing was not something he had ever been allowed to do. Eric jabbed a finger at him and announced that his brother was only angry because he had lost, like an idiot. Sir Temerin watched all of this with sweat on his forehead, wanting to say something kind and finding nothing. Then he gave up on kind, filled his lungs, and simply shouted at the boy. Telling him he did his best would not help, the knight said. So why was he being so stubborn about it? Robert looked up with his eyes hard, and for the first time he actually listened. There was nothing left to do about it now, Temerin said. So forget it, and go and train harder. Everyone in the room turned to stare at the drunk, red-bearded knight who had just said something wise. The emperor remarked that occasionally, in between the drinking, the man did produce something genuinely useful. Temerin was not listening. He was thinking about the person with the crossbow, and how certain she had been. The following week began with a howl of despair from a room on the upper floor. Kiwi sat on the edge of the bed with a bowl and a spoon, and told Eileen to stop turning her head away. The bowl held something gray and thick that had been labeled optimistically, oatmeal banana puree. Eileen announced in the wobbling voice of a toddler that she did not like this, and meant every syllable. The spoon went in anyway, and her eyes bulged, and her face went a color not found in nature. The royal chef was on leave, Kiwi explained brightly, so she had cooked. Eileen begged her never to cook again. Then Kiwi paused, thinking, and said that, come to think of it, they would be seeing rather more of each other now. From the doorway came a strangled noise, and both of them turned around to see who had made it. Eileen asked whether he was Sir Temerin. The knight in the doorway forgot how to stand up straight. He threw both hands over his head and laughed at a volume that made the windows worry. He had sworn to protect her with his life the day he was made her guard. Within a month, he would raise a hand against the Queen of Yulia to keep that promise. Then he looked at the remaining bowl and announced with terrible enthusiasm that he would feed all of it to her. Eileen lay back down and quietly considered whether dying of food poisoning counted as an assassination. Kiwi said she had an errand and asked him to watch the child. He swore that he would protect her with everything he had. Then he stopped and asked in a very small voice whether she was still Miss Kiwi to him. She laughed and told him to drop the miss and just call her Kiwi. They would be seeing each other often, she said, so they might as well get along, and she winked at him. He stood there holding a baby with his mouth open while she walked out and said he was honored. Then he muttered to himself, entirely sincere, that she really was the most mysterious woman he had ever met. Eileen stared up at him from the crook of his arm and demanded to know how any of that had just happened. 2 floors below, something ceramic hit a wall, and 2 maids screamed and ducked. A man in black and gold sat at the head of the table and did not so much as glance at the mess. He asked her, without turning his head to look at her once, whether she had finally gone completely insane. Whatever her rank, he said, a person who threatens the king gets removed, and she knew that perfectly well. Queen Sophia stood at the other end of the table with her hands in fists and her face burning. He suggested she calm down and take a seat, and made the suggestion sound like a door closing. She sat. 2 maids arranged themselves at the wall and tried to become furniture. He asked her again what her motive was for putting Temarin next to that thing. She said the conversation was going nowhere. He asked what motive she imagined he could possibly have. She set her cup down and suggested he was trying to hand Prince Robert more authority. He laughed at her. Robert had nothing to do with it. He had sent Temarin to protect Eileen, nothing more. "Why Temarin?" she shouted. "And why protect a creature that spits fire and shrugs off an assassin's blade?" He said it was funny to hear that from her and reminded her quietly that he was the king of this country. Did he need her permission, he asked, when he made a decision in his own palace? She started to protest, and he laughed again and said she still had not come to her senses. It must be her upbringing, he said. Women of her family always try to rule the country the moment they become queen. She said his words were excessive. He said it was a matter of recorded history, and let it sit. The broken pot lay in pieces on the floor between them, and neither of them looked at it. The queen who threatened the king, he said, and asked how she thought that would sound written down. If she ever tried to handle him the wrong way again, he told her. She swallowed, and she knew exactly what was coming, and there was nothing she could do to stop it arriving. Then her precious second son, Eric, would be barred from the succession forever, and she would have done it herself. Sophia had been queen of Yulia for years, and there had never been a shortage of opinions about how. 4 silhouettes on a violet sky, all of them talking, none of them saying it to her face. She had been born noble, they said, but beside Queen Nivalis, she had been little better than a maid. She had spent years bowing in that corridor while another woman wore the crown ahead of her. And when Queen Nivalis died of her illness, Sophia was standing close enough to smile about it. Some said a curse had done it, and pointed at things drawn on floors in rooms nobody was allowed into. Others were certain about poison, and could describe the cup and the hand that had poured it. Everyone suspected Sophia. Everyone always had suspected Sophia, and it changed exactly nothing, for years. Because who in the empire would dare do anything at all to the new queen? The rumor went that her family, the Andrias, had put her where she was on purpose. She had been aimed at Emperor Loki, and Prince Eric was the proof it had worked. The rest was never proven. And once she wore the crown, she began her own work, and there was a great deal of blood in it. Anyone who spread a rumor about the queen or opposed her was found to have died of something. The old queen's faction was wiped out entirely, name by name, until there was nobody left to remember them. Except one man, General Temarin, Knight Commander of the Yulia Empire, who simply would not die. The last living member of Novalis's household, the emperor's right hand, and a permanent thorn in Sophia's side. And in the end, it was Temarin and nobody else who cracked that marriage cleanly in half. He knelt before that throne and accused the queen to her husband's face in front of the court. He had dug up every rotten detail of the Andria family and laid all of it on the table. Loki went cold towards his wife, and the 2 of them have stood at opposite ends of rooms ever since. In the end, the emperor executed the whole Andria family, all of them, without a single exception made, including Sophia's own father, the Duke of Cohen, and she was made to watch it happen. What was left afterwards was a woman shaped like a queen, with everything else scooped out of her. Everything, that is, except one small hand that kept finding hers in the corridor. Her only son, and she had promised herself that this child, at least, would be protected. The queen who threatened the emperor, it did not sound like a good thing to be called. And if anything like it ever happened again, he said, without raising his voice at all. Then the second prince, the one she had built her entire life and every calculation around, would never have a chance at the throne. She sat there and let the sentence finish. She swallowed her tea and said nothing, because she understood exactly how little of a bluff it was. This was her husband. Whatever else he was, he did not make threats he had no intention of keeping. But Eric, she thought, with the cup halfway to her mouth. What was supposed to happen to Eric? It was not his fault, she said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. He asked whether she really believed that, and then asked whether she hated Robert. He said he was not criticizing, that fighting over a throne is simply what families like theirs do. But lately he said she had gone too far, and he asked whether she understood what he meant. She shut her eyes and smiled the way people smile when the alternative is screaming. She begged his pardon, said she had somewhere to be, and stood up from the table. She wished him a good day and turned to leave, and he said one more thing to her back. There was also, he said, the matter of the dragon she had referred to earlier. Her name is Eileen, he said. Do not be so rude about her again. Sophia smiled at the closed door with her eyes shut and her earrings shaking very slightly. Somewhere else in the palace, a window stood open onto a pink afternoon, and none of it reached her. Two women walked the red carpet, and the guards along the wall bowed as the queen passed. And behind her, someone watched her go and thought that she really was a troublesome woman. A few days later, footsteps came down the corridor, and Piat turned around with her arms full. Sir Temerin had arrived asking for Kiwi, carrying something he had been sent to fetch yesterday. Piat said Kiwi never asks anyone for help. Temerin beamed and said it must be because she trusts him. She had asked him to keep quiet about what was inside the bottle, which made Piat look at it rather harder. Then she reminded him that, important errand or not, they were supposed to be taking Eileen out today. Piat asked the child where she wanted to go. Eileen wanted to see the best part of the entire castle. The best part, Temerin said, would be the Millennium Room at the very top. The goddess's room, Piat said. He asked the kid whether she really wanted to go there, and laughed in a way that Eileen did not enjoy. Piat went white and told him it was a prison for the most dangerous criminals in the empire. He said he was joking, put a hand on her shoulder, and insisted the view up there was genuinely the best. Then he offered the Knight's Hall instead, where he had once watched a fight that put blood on every wall. Down the corridor, two voices were already arguing, and one of them was about to be put on the floor in front of a queen. A woman was shouting for her bodyguards to seize somebody, and the somebody was not backing down. Piat asked why two people were having a screaming match in the middle of the hall, and then recognized them. Sylvia and Kiwi standing chest to chest, both of them well past the point of being talked down. Temerin said he did not know what this was about, but that they had to be stopped immediately. If this continued, he said, someone would get hurt, and at that exact moment Sylvia shoved her. Kiwi's eyes went wide as the floor stopped being where she expected the floor to be. And something in Sir Temerin's face changed completely, all at once, the way weather changes. He came down that corridor shouting her name with everything he had, and he was not thinking about rank at all. The Knight Commander of Yulia crossed a marble hall at a dead sprint for a woman he had known 3 weeks. Boots hit the wooden floor, and the whole corridor turned to look at what was happening. He got there. Piat arrived behind him with the child, asking whether either of them was hurt. A hand came up between the two women, palm open, asking everyone present to be calm about this. He was holding her by the arm in the window light, and she said evenly that they were fine. Sylvia stared at the two of them and said his name as though she had never seen him before. He asked Kiwi whether she was injured anywhere. She said she was all right, and thanked him. Then Piat asked what had actually happened, and Kiwi admitted this one was hard to explain. Sylvia demanded Temerin arrest her at once, claiming she had been threatened over the queen's jade comb. Kiwi said that made no sense, that she had the emperor's own permission, and was asked how anyone trusts a beggar. Temerin put himself between the two of them and ordered them both to stop shouting in the middle of the hall. Then a pair of white shoes stopped on the red carpet behind all of them, and the corridor went silent. A voice asked with perfect politeness and no warmth at all, what the hell was going on here? Kiwi turned around, recognized the voice before the face, and her expression fell off. Queen Sophia stood in the doorway with a painted fan raised to her mouth, waiting for somebody to explain. Piat pulled the child tight against her and thought that whoever the queen was on, it would not be their side. Sylvia rushed to say this beggar had demanded the queen's own belongings, and Kiwi shouted back about permission. The fan came down. So she had the emperor's permission, the queen said, delighted, as if handed a gift. Which meant, she said, that the queen was supposed to shut her mouth and hand it over. Was that the argument? Behind them, Tamarin's face changed, because he had heard that particular tone from her before. Kiwi tried to say something and got nowhere, and two people watching had no idea what to do. One after another, the queen said, every single one of them had decided they could ignore her. She smiled behind the fan and asked whether none of them considered her worth counting anymore. Begging would not help, she told Kiwi, and the word she used was not one queens are supposed to use. Kiwi said she had done nothing, that she had come to collect something she was told to collect. The queen asked how many times this had happened now and told her to stop talking. She took hold of Kiwi's arm and hauled her bodily upright off the carpet in front of everyone. She asked whether a person had to be beaten unconscious before they regained their senses. The emperor had treated her so well, the queen said, that she had forgotten what she actually was. Kiwi looked her in the eye and told her to kill her and be done with it. Somebody nearly took that literally. The hand came down across her face hard enough to snap her head sideways. She stayed on her knees with her eyes shut, breathing carefully, and did not make a sound. Then a hand closed on the queen's wrist before the second blow, and she turned around slowly. Tamarin bowed his head and begged forgiveness, and said Emperor Loki had ordered him to protect them. Furthermore, he said, he could not stand here and watch this happen. The queen said his name like a curse. He had been getting in her way since Queen Nivalis was alive. He said he had only ever protected his master. And then something small came off Piat's hip at speed, screaming, and went straight for the queen. Sophia shrieked at the dragon fastened to her sleeve and called it a damned animal. She demanded the beast be removed. Piat begged Eileen to stop, and told Kiwi to get out while she could. Kiwi looked at the child hanging off the Queen of Yulia by the teeth, and quietly said thank you. When it was over, the corridor was empty and the chandeliers were burning as though nothing had occurred. The queen, once she had her composure back, settled the whole affair as quietly as anyone could have hoped. No matter how long Eileen turned it over, she could not work out why. And from that day, Kiwi went strange. She had been like this ever since, Eileen complained, and it was frankly disgusting to watch. She asked her why she had saved her from the queen, and Kiwi called her the weirdest dragon she had ever met. Then Kiwi asked carefully whether she still had any memories of her previous life. Eileen said she had none at all, and did not realize the question had not been about a Korean schoolgirl. Kiwi flopped backwards with the child on her shoulder and stared at the ceiling for a while. Then she pinched her cheek hard and asked why she was not angry, and why her eyes had not changed color. She said there was a mirror on the table and told her to go and look at herself in it. It occurred to Eileen then that she had never once seen her own face in this life. Gold eyes looked back at her out of the glass, bright as struck coins, and she stared at them. Kiwi asked her to breathe fire and to watch her own eyes in the mirror while she did it. The gold went red. Kiwi said that was normal now, but that it would keep going darker as she grew. The darker the eyes, she said, the less reason and the more violence, until one day she might not come back from it. Eileen asked why she could remember nothing of the life before. A dragon's body dies, Kiwi said, but the soul does not. She sat up on the bed, suddenly a great deal less interested in being charming about any of this. And protecting someone other than her owner, Kiwi added, was not something the record said dragons do. The proof was in the notebook her grandmother had left her, in handwriting that had faded almost off the page. The dragon of the fallen Pylian Empire, it said, had killed its own owner and burned everything before it vanished. There was little more than that because there had been almost no survivors. Only one certainty: it had hated humans. That was why she had been nervous around Eileen from the beginning. But then the child had put herself in front of her. Eileen promised she would never do anything like that, and made her seal it with a pinky, and Kiwi laughed and agreed. Then somebody knocked, and Kiwi turned towards the door with the smile still on her face. Piat was outside calling both their names and apologizing for the intrusion, and saying it was urgent. She came in fast and found the two of them exactly where she expected, which did not slow her down. Kiwi asked whether the queen had ordered her arrested, and reasoned the guards would already be here if so. The king wanted to see both of them, Piat said, in his study, immediately. They walked the long carpet together, relieved it was not about the queen, and completely unable to guess the reason. At the doors, a servant said the king was waiting, and stepped aside to let them through. Kiwi put her head in first and said awkwardly that they were sorry to intrude. Then she stopped dead in the doorway with her eyes very wide, and Eileen walked into the back of her. There was a silver-haired stranger standing in the middle of the Emperor's study, and he was smiling at them. Eileen's first coherent thought was that he was extremely good-looking, which she immediately regretted. He apologized charmingly for the surprise and said he had heard a great deal about the two of them. He introduced himself as Theodore of the Pan Empire, and it would be a while yet before anyone in that room learned who had really been paying the assassins. Then he smiled wider and said that it was a pleasure. Especially, he added, and let it hang. Especially to meet Eileen Deshea, whom he very much wanted to be close to, and he held out his hand. He offered to take her back to Pan with him, where she would receive the finest treatment in the world. Eileen stood there with her mouth open, entirely unequipped for whatever this was supposed to be. She admitted privately that she could not manage to say no to a man who looked like that. If she really wanted to, he said, tilting his head, and left the rest of the sentence hanging in the air. A voice from behind the desk said his name, and the Prince of Pan stopped talking. He was not to speak to her without permission. Theodore laughed and said he had only been joking. Loki reminded him that he had arrived unannounced, threatening to tell the world about Eileen unless he met her. He asked whether the assassination attempts had anything to do with Pan. Theodore asked mildly whether that had happened. He had overheard about her, he said. He had simply wanted to see her with his own eyes. And besides, he asked, did the Emperor really think he would confess to hiring an assassin? Then he added that she was not imprinted yet, and said, thoughtfully, that he rather wanted her now. 3 faces in that room turned towards him, and none of them were smiling anymore. The Emperor of the Yulia Empire told him, very quietly and without moving at all, to watch his mouth. Theodore said he had never been able to hide his feelings, and looked pleased about it. He decided he had caused enough offense for one visit and turned for the door. Kiwi stood in his path and looked up at him, and something passed between the two of them. She watched him go with her jaw set, and she did not look remotely surprised to have seen him. His hand stopped on the door handle. "Oh," he said, "and one more thing." He said her name from the doorway, and Eileen's head came up before she could stop it. "I will be seeing you," he told her, and smiled, and left the room with the door open behind him. His voice came back down the corridor, promising that he would see her soon. Eileen stood in the middle of the study while 2 men behind the desk decided what to do about it. Then the Emperor said that everyone in the room was to leave immediately, except for Eileen. Kiwi bowed, said yes, and went out past the old man at the door without looking at anyone. The door shut. Eileen stood there wondering what on earth had got into Kiwi just now. She had been different today. Did she know the prince from somewhere? Then Loki said her name. He held his hand out to her across the carpet and told her to come here. She crossed the room and climbed up beside him, and he let her get settled before he spoke. She looked up at him and asked in her small voice whether he was all right. He said he was not going to let that man take her. He said it as a fact, not as a comfort. He told her they would simply spend the day here together instead, and the study went quiet. Elsewhere in the palace, a bedroom window opened, and a silver-haired man waved and said it had been a long time. Kiwi stood in the middle of her room with her arms folded and called him an idiot. He said that was no way to greet an old friend, and neither of them had ever told anyone how far back they went. Then he tossed her something. She caught it and asked what it was supposed to be. A cream, he said. He had made it himself, and he held his hand out flat to show her. When Robert cut her last time, he said, she had never treated the wound properly. She said she could not. He laughed and asked whether she had missed him, and told her she was a true friend, and she said nothing. Then she stopped playing. She said she had to talk to him about something. Stay away from Eileen. He could not steal that dragon, she said, and for once the Prince of Pan did not have an answer ready. Back in the study, someone knocked and asked whether the Emperor had a moment. The doors opened on a woman in a blue and white gown who had come to say something important. Queen Sophia stopped in the doorway, and the dragon on the carpet quietly wished she were somewhere else. She looked down at the carpet and asked what that thing was doing inside his private study. Because he had allowed it, he said. Did she have a problem with that? He called Eileen over. Sophia said it was ridiculous when he would not even let his own son through that door. If it were Robert, she could understand it. She knew the dragon mattered to the kingdom, but this was too much. He was holding the child the way a man holds his daughter, and everybody in the room could see it. You treat her like she is yours, the queen said, and folded her arms and waited. Loki smiled at his wife across the study and said that he rather liked the sound of that word. Eileen looked up at him sharply because she had heard something arrive in his voice. He lifted her up in the window light and asked her whether she would like to be a princess. Two women in that room stopped breathing at exactly the same moment, for two entirely different reasons. A dragon and now a princess as well, Eileen thought. 2 whole lifetimes, and it had come to this. And then it occurred to her with real horror that the woman glaring at her would become her mother. Sophia smiled and said he was joking. It was not a question because she could not afford it to be. Did he look like he was joking? He said. He intended to look into the adoption process immediately. She shut her eyes, and everything she had built her life around began sliding towards the edge. He told her to leave and never to enter his study again without permission. She bowed with her voice shaking and called him Your Majesty and went out without another word. In her own rooms, she turned on Sylvia and asked about the person who knew dragons well. She wanted to meet that person, she said. She wanted to meet them now. Elsewhere, Loki sat with his gloves off and demanded to know why he could not simply do it. It was not illegal, the priest said, but experience had taught them not to get too close to a dragon. He knew what the man meant. Dragons are evil, and they use humans, and everybody has heard the stories. Which was exactly why he said it would be better to be close to Eileen than to be far from her. Raise her as a daughter. The priest inclined his head and agreed it was a good idea. Of course it was, the man agreed. However, he said and left the words standing there. Had the queen agreed to it? Loki put a gloved hand over his mouth and said nothing. Both parents must consent to an adoption. He would have to ask her opinion whether he wanted to or not. He sat back on the throne with his hand over his eyes and let out a long breath. Would he have to threaten her? She was never going to agree to this, and both of them knew it. Sophia, who wanted nothing in this world except her son on that throne, would fight him to the last inch. A gloved finger came up and pointed, and the man in front of him understood he was being dismissed. So tell me, Eileen Deshea, when a crown finally calls you daughter, whose creature will you be?